Hi, I'm Andrew with Infinity Cutting Tools. Making picture frames is a very common project that can be a little bit tricky. Whether it's choosing the right profile or making tight-fitting miters in the corners, this can really be an intimidating project. Let me show you how I made all of these frames here in the Infinity Tool shop using the new Infinity 6-piece frame making master router bit package. I'll also give you a few of my tips for getting perfect fitting miters in the corners of your frames. The first step in designing a frame is determining how thick the frame needs to be to hold everything we want to put inside of it. I like to use a stepped rabbet router bit to make the rabbet, so I'm going to use that as a basic guide, and I'm going to stack together all the things that I'm going to put into the frame, from the glass, the picture, a mat, and the backer, to ensure that the material I make my frame from is thick enough to hold all these things. Then I can move on and determine how the rest of the frame needs to look. The width of the frame really comes down to personal preference. Of course, the size of the frame overall will be determined by the picture you're putting in it, but a wide, elaborate frame can work on a smaller picture and a narrow frame on a larger picture. I do like to choose the router bits I'm going to use to make the profile of my frame at this point so that I can determine the exact widths of those frames before I start cutting my stock to width. I also like to make sure when I'm cutting my pieces of stock to length that I have enough to get at least a top rail and a side rail out of one length. This typically keeps my pieces from being excessively long while I'm milling them without sacrificing too much to waste. First frame I made with this set is the most simple. It uses an Infinity 56517 for the profile. The width of the frame is 1 3/16 of an inch wide, and then I used the stepped rabbet router bit to make the rabbet for the glass in the picture on the back. My second frame uses an Infinity 56515, but I made this frame in 2 passes through the router table. I set the bit height and ran the material, then flipped it over and made a second pass to double the width of the profile. This frame measures in at 1 7/16 of an inch wide, and of course uses the stepped rabbet bit on the back to hold the picture. My third frame is very similar to the second, but it includes the addition of a bead in the center of the profile. I used the same 56515 to make the profiles on the outer edges. Then I used an Infinity 39001 full bead router bit to add an additional bead in the very center of the frame. This requires 2 passes through the 56515 as well as 2 passes through the full bead router bit. So 4 total passes creates this unique profile that you're not likely to find anywhere else. My fourth frame really is quite simple. It only requires 2 router bits to make the profile. A 56516 picture frame profile bit to make the inner profile, and an 02500 1/4-inch edge bead bit to make the bead on the outside edge of the frame. What's nice about this frame is it leaves a flat portion in the center that can be adjusted whether you want a narrower or wider frame stock. You can really tailor this design to fit a large variety of pictures and settings. This frame measures in at right around 2 inches wide. The final frame I want to show you is the most complex, but it's not all that difficult to make if you know the correct steps. We use the same process as we did for the previous picture frame, except for where the flat was on that frame, we're going to inlay a strip to add some additional contrast and character. I used a 56515 profile bit to make a 5/8 inch wide inlay strip. I cut those at the table saw, and I used my Infinity Dadonator to create a dado or groove through the flat portion left in the frame that will then receive that inlaid strip. It's quite simple to make. You just have to take your time and you can get great results like we did with this frame. This frame, again, is the exact same width as the previous frame at 2 inches wide. When cutting the dado at the table saw to receive the inlay strip, you want to set it up to be the same width as that strip. So I make the strip first, and then I can use that strip to make sure that my dado stack is exactly the right width. Then it's just a matter of setting my fence and making the cut. Now I like my inlay strip to stand a bit proud of the rest of the surface of the frame, so my inlay strip I cut to 3/8 of an inch thick, and the dado I cut to 3/16 of an inch thick. This allows my inlay strip to stand just a little bit proud of the rest of the frame. To cut my miters, I skip the miter saw and go to the table saw and use a dedicated mitering and crosscut sled. I personally like the Incra Miter 5000. It gives me the ability to really dial in and get precise mitered joints. I also use a combination square to ensure that my blade is square to my table, my fence is perfectly set up 45 degrees to the blade, and that the fence on my sled is perfectly 90 degrees to the table as well. Make sure you check that the fence on the sled is perfectly square to the table. Otherwise, you can end up in situations where your frames may have a good 45-degree cut, but the miters are open or closed because they were made at a slight angle to the table, which will affect the end result. Making sure that we make perfect 45-degree cuts for our frames is really important. But just as important to getting quality frames is that all of our pieces are exactly the same length. The right side piece of the frame has to be exactly the same length as the left, and the top exactly the same length as the bottom. If these are a little bit off, it doesn't matter how good our miters are, the frame will simply not fit together properly and have nice tight corners. I like to use a sled with a stop to ensure that my frame pieces are all cut to exactly the same length. I flip my stop up and out of the way, make my first 45-degree miter cut, then I take my workpiece, flip it over, flip my stop down, slide my fresh cut miter into the stop, and make my second cut. This ensures that I get a very precise length workpiece. I cut all the top and bottom rails first, using the same method to ensure that I have all my top and bottom rails exactly the same length. Then I will reset my stop and use the same method to cut my right and left pieces for my frames. Once all my pieces are cut, it's time to clamp and glue them together. I like to use a 4-corner frame clamp because it allows me to see that all my joints are fitting perfectly together. If I use just a standard corner clamp, this can be a little bit tricky to ensure that all 4 corners are fitting up just right. I also make sure that whatever clamp I'm using, I have access. I like to pin the corners of my frames with brads. This allows me to glue the corners, pin them, and then remove the frame from the clamp and start working on the next so that I'm not standing around waiting for the glue to dry. The final step of making a frame is to clean up any excess glue. I really like to do this while the glue is wet because I can use a damp rag and ensure that I get all the glue out of those profiles and I don't have to try and sand it away when it's time to finish. Inevitably, if I skip this step, I'll end up with those little glue shadow lines after I apply my finish. Because I can take my frame out of the clamps, it's easy to get the back side and in the rabbet of the frame as well, which means as soon as the glue is dry, I'm ready to apply my final finish. There you have it, 5 simple frames made with the Infinity Master Frame Making Router Bit Package. For more information on this project, be sure to check out our blog at infinitytools.com. You'll be able to find information not only on framing, but all the projects that we work on here in the Infinity Tools shop. Also, be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date on what's going on here at Infinity Cutting Tools.